Okay, I need you to understand something about what's happening right now. And I need you to stay with me because the stakes here are almost incomprehensible. At some point this week, 9 people sitting in a marble building in Washington, D.C. are going to make a decision that will determine whether the United States government owes American companies and consumers somewhere between $133 billion and possibly $200 billion. Not million, billion, with a B. And that decision, when it comes, will answer a question that goes far beyond money. It will answer whether a president of the United States can declare an economic emergency whenever he wants, bypass Congress entirely, and impose what amounts to the largest tax increase in 3 decades without a single vote from the people's representatives. If you're just finding this right now, I'm going to ask you to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to walk you through isn't just a legal case. It's a constitutional crisis playing out in slow motion, and the clock is ticking toward February 20th. That's next week. That's when the Supreme Court has scheduled its next opinion day, and legal observers across the country believe that's when we're finally going to get an answer to the question that has hung over the American economy for nearly a year. Does Donald Trump have the authority to do what he did? Or did he just commit the most expensive presidential overreach in modern American history? Here's what we know. On November 5th, 2025, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in what the administration itself has called the most important case of this term. The case is technically called Learning Resources versus Trump, but everyone in Washington just calls it the Tariff case. And the reason it matters, the reason it has global markets on edge, the reason companies like Costco and Toyota and Revlon are preparing lawsuits demanding refunds is because of what happened 91 days before those oral arguments. On April 2nd, 2025, Donald Trump stood in the Rose Garden and announced what he called Liberation Day. He declared a national economic emergency under a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And using that emergency authority, he imposed tariffs ranging from 10% to 50% on imports from virtually every country on earth. Not just China, not just strategic competitors, everyone. Canada, Mexico, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia. If you sold goods to the United States, you were hit with tariffs. And those tariffs started generating revenue immediately, billions of dollars per month flowing into the U.S. Treasury. By the time the Supreme Court heard arguments in November, the government had already collected over $100 billion. As of today, that number is closer to $133 billion and climbing. Every single day, roughly $2 billion in tariff revenue comes in. That's not a projection. That's happening right now. And here's the thing that makes this case so extraordinary. Every single federal judge who has looked at these tariffs has said the same thing. They're illegal. District courts in multiple jurisdictions ruled that Trump exceeded his authority. Appeals courts upheld those rulings. The Ninth Circuit, in a divided panel decision, explicitly stated that the tariffs violated the separation of powers because the Constitution grants Congress, not the president, the power to levy taxes and regulate commerce. But the tariffs kept getting collected because the Supreme Court, while it agreed to hear the case on an expedited basis, refused to pause the tariffs while the litigation played out. So we've been living for months in this bizarre legal limbo where the government is collecting what lower courts have deemed an unconstitutional tax, and everyone is waiting to see if the Supreme Court agrees. Let me give you some historical context here because this matters. The last time the Supreme Court confronted a question this fundamental about presidential emergency powers was 1952. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. President Truman tried to seize steel mills during the Korean War, claiming national emergency. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that he exceeded his authority. Justice Robert Jackson's concurrence established the framework we still use today. When the president acts with congressional authorization, his power is at its maximum. When Congress is silent, he's in a zone of twilight. But when the president acts contrary to Congress's will, his power is at its lowest ebb. That's exactly where Trump is with these tariffs. Because here's the critical fact. Congress explicitly granted itself the power to impose tariffs through multiple statutes. Section 301 for trade violations, Section 232 for national security threats, Section 122 for balance of payments emergencies. Each of those statutes lays out specific procedures, specific justifications, specific limits. Trump didn't use any of them. Instead, he invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law designed for genuine international crisis, freezing assets of terrorists, sanctioning rogue regimes, responding to acute threats. And he used it to impose a permanent system of tariffs on allies and adversaries alike, claiming that America's trade deficit constituted an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security. During oral arguments, the skepticism from the justices was palpable. Justice Elena Kagan asked the government's lawyer point blank, if the president can do this under IPA, what can't he do? If trade deficits justify emergency tariffs, couldn't a president declare a healthcare emergency and seize hospitals? Couldn't a president declare an education emergency and federalize schools? Where's the limiting principle? The government's answer was essentially, trust us, we wouldn't do that. The president is exercising discretion responsibly. And Justice Kagan's response, captured in the transcript, was devastating. The whole point of constitutional limits, she said, is that we don't rely on self-restraint. We rely on law. Even Chief Justice John Roberts, who tends to defer to executive power, expressed concern. He pointed out that if the president can unilaterally impose tariffs this way, then Congress's carefully constructed trade statutes become meaningless. Why would Congress bother writing detailed tariff laws if a president can just declare an emergency and do whatever he wants? But here's where it gets complicated, and this is why the case has taken so long to decide. During those same oral arguments, Roberts also noted that the tariffs, whatever their legality, have been in place for months. Markets have adjusted, businesses have adapted, foreign governments have negotiated around them. And he asked the plaintiff's lawyer, what happens if we strike these down? Do we create chaos by suddenly invalidating 9 months of economic policy? That question reveals the bind the court is in. If they rule against Trump, they're potentially triggering the largest tax refund in American history. Every company that paid these tariffs, and we're talking tens of thousands of businesses, would have a claim for reimbursement. The government would owe not just the $133 billion collected so far, but potentially another 30 to 40 billion by the time all the claims are processed. We're looking at close to $200 billion. But if they rule for Trump, they're effectively handing every future president a blank check. Any president of any party could declare an economic emergency over anything. Trade deficits, budget deficits, student debt, healthcare costs, and use emergency powers to enact sweeping policies without congressional approval. That's not a hypothetical concern. That's the core of what this case is about. So the justices have been deliberating for 91 days. That's significantly longer than typical expedited cases, which usually resolve in 39 to 67 days. It's even longer than most regular cases at this stage. And the delay itself tells a story. This is a court that is deeply divided, not just on the outcome, but on how to write an opinion that doesn't blow up either the economy or the separation of powers. Legal experts have been watching the calendar obsessively. Every week, the court issues opinions on cases it's already decided. Every week, the tariff case doesn't appear. And every week, the speculation intensifies. Are the justices negotiating? Is someone writing a concurrence that's holding things up? Did the vote shift after oral arguments? Then this week, the court announced that February 20th will be an opinion day. It's listed as a non-argument session, meaning the justices won't be hearing new cases. They'll just be issuing decisions. And for the first time in months, court watchers believe this could be it. The tariff decision could drop on February 20th. It's not guaranteed. The court could issue opinions in other cases and punt the tariff decision further down the road. But the timing makes sense. The case was argued in early November. 91 days is pushing the outer limit of reasonable deliberation time. The justices know that every day they wait, another $2 billion gets collected in tariffs that might be unconstitutional. The pressure to decide is enormous. Now, let me tell you what's happening behind the scenes. Sources familiar with the court's dynamics describe justices who are genuinely torn. The 6 conservatives theoretically have the votes to uphold Trump, but it's not simple. Justice Kavanaugh expressed serious concerns during arguments. Justice Barrett asked pointed questions about IEPA's intent. Even Justice Gorsuch seemed uncomfortable with presidents bypassing Congress this completely. The three liberal justices are clearly ready to strike down the tariffs. What some observers think is happening is Chief Justice Roberts trying to build a broader coalition, something closer to 7-2 or 8-1 instead of a partisan 6-3 split. That kind of consensus takes time to negotiate. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is projecting confidence publicly while preparing for disaster privately. On social media, Trump has called this case a matter of life or death for the country. He's posted that evil American-hating forces are fighting us at the Supreme Court. He's urged his supporters to pray that the 9 justices show great wisdom and do the right thing for America. But behind the scenes, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been telling Congress that if the court strikes down the tariffs, the administration has backup plans. They could reimpose the same tariffs using Section 301, claiming trade violations. They could use Section 232, claiming national security threats. They could use Section 122, claiming balance of payments emergencies. Bessent's exact words to CNBC were, "We could recreate the exact tariff structure. It would just be more cumbersome, more inconvenient." Trump himself, in a Fox News interview, admitted the same thing. Asked what happens if they lose at the Supreme Court, he said, "We will find something, some other way of doing a similar thing, but it'll be more inconvenient." Think about what that means. The administration is essentially saying, even if the Supreme Court rules we broke the law, we'll just find another law to do the same thing. Which raises the question, if you can do it legally through other statutes, why didn't you do it that way in the first place? The answer, according to trade law experts, is that those other statutes have requirements. Section 301 requires proving actual trade violations. Section 232 requires a Commerce Department investigation into national security threats. Section 122 requires demonstrating serious balance of payments problems, and the tariffs automatically expire after 150 days unless Congress extends them. IEPA let Trump skip all of that. He just declared an emergency and imposed the tariffs immediately. No investigation, no congressional approval, no expiration date. That's why he used it. And that's why it's illegal, according to every lower court that's reviewed it. Here's what's at stake economically. The Peterson Institute estimates these tariffs cost the average household $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 in 2026. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York found American consumers bear almost the entire cost, not foreign governments, as Trump claims. Companies are filing lawsuits now. Costco, Revlon, Bumblebee Foods, Toyota, Kawasaki, major corporations with armies of lawyers preparing to fight for every dollar if the court rules in their favor. And if the court strikes down the tariffs, those companies don't just get refunds, they get interest. We're talking billions in interest on top of refunds. The total bill could approach $200 billion, which brings us to the political dimension. The midterm elections are 9 months away. Congressional Republicans are already nervous about the tariffs because voters hate inflation, and tariffs are inflationary. But they've been able to defend Trump by saying, let's wait and see what the Supreme Court says. If the court strikes down the tariffs, that defense evaporates. Democrats will spend the entire campaign season hammering Republicans. You supported illegal tariffs that cost families over $1,000. You backed a president who ignored the Constitution and lost in court. That's a devastating attack line, and it's based on facts, not spin. On the flip side, if the court upholds the tariffs, Democrats will campaign on a different message. The Supreme Court just handed presidents dictatorial power over the economy. We need to win back Congress to check this overreach. Either way, this decision becomes the defining issue of the 2026 midterms. And the justices know that. They know that their decision will shape not just legal doctrine, but political reality. Now, prediction markets, which aggregate bets on future events, show something interesting. On Kalshi, a federally authorized betting platform, over 4.9 million has been wagered on whether the Supreme Court will uphold Trump's tariffs. And right now, bettors are giving Trump only a 32% chance of winning. 68% of the money is on the court striking down the tariffs. That's not a guarantee. Prediction markets have been wrong before. but it reflects the consensus among people who are putting actual money on the line. Anthony Scaramucci, the former White House communications director turned hedge fund manager, publicly stated he thinks there's a 70% chance the court strikes down the tariffs. His reasoning: Congress has the constitutional power to levy taxes, and tariffs are taxes. The court won't let a president usurp that power permanently. Legal scholars are divided, but most of the ones I've spoken to lean toward a ruling against Trump. The Youngstown precedent is just too strong. The textual argument is too clear. The Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's in Article 1, Section 8. It's not ambiguous. Presidents have emergency powers, but those powers can't override explicit constitutional grants to Congress. There's a phrase that keeps coming up in legal analysis of this case: structural constitution. It refers to the fundamental architecture of American government, the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial power. The idea is that you can't just read individual clauses in isolation. You have to understand how the whole system fits together. And when you look at the structure, it's clear that Congress is supposed to control taxing and spending, while the president is supposed to execute the laws Congress passes. What Trump did with these tariffs was reverse that structure. He made the law, and he's daring Congress to stop him. That's not how the system is supposed to work. And if the Supreme Court allows it, they're not just deciding a case about tariffs, they're rewriting the Constitution. So we wait. February 20th is 6 days away as I'm recording this. The Supreme Court will issue opinions. We don't know which cases. We don't know how many. But for the first time in months, there's a real possibility that we'll finally get an answer. Will the court uphold the largest assertion of unilateral presidential economic power in modern history? Or will they strike it down and potentially trigger a financial reckoning that could reshape trade policy for a generation? Here's what happens if the court rules against Trump. Within hours, companies will file claims for refunds. The Court of International Trade, which handles tariff disputes, will be flooded with cases. The Treasury Department will have to figure out how to process billions in claims without destabilizing the budget. Congress will face enormous pressure to pass legislation clarifying presidential trade authority. And Trump himself will have to decide whether to accept the ruling or try to reimpose the tariffs through other legal mechanisms, which would trigger another round of lawsuits. Here's what happens if the court rules for Trump. Congressional Democrats will introduce legislation to revoke the tariffs, though it won't pass without Republican support. Progressive groups will call for court reform, expanding the number of justices or imposing term limits. Trade partners will retaliate with their own tariffs, escalating the trade war. And every future president, Republican or Democrat, will know they can declare economic emergencies to bypass Congress whenever it's politically convenient. Both outcomes are genuinely consequential. Both will be studied in law schools and economics departments for decades. And one of them will become reality next week or the week after, or whenever the justices finally release their decision. I want to be very clear about something. This isn't partisan analysis. This is constitutional law. Whether you support Trump's trade policies or oppose them, whether you think tariffs are good for America or bad, the legal question is simple. Did he have the authority to impose them this way? Every lower court said no. The Supreme Court is the final word, and that word is coming. Subscribe to this channel right now, because when that decision drops, you need to see the analysis immediately, not 3 days later when cable news has moved on. Hit the notification bell, like this video. The algorithm decides what spreads, and you decide whether this information reaches people who need to understand what's actually at stake. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think the court will do. Will they uphold the tariffs? Will they strike them down? Will they split the difference with some narrow ruling that doesn't really resolve anything? I genuinely want to know what you're thinking, because this is the kind of case where predictions are hard and the consequences are enormous. Here's what I'll be watching for. First, does the decision come on February 20th, or does the court delay again? Second, is it a majority opinion, or are there multiple concurrences and dissents? A fractured court suggests deep disagreement that could signal future challenges. Third, how broad is the ruling? Does the court decide this case narrowly, just on the specific facts of these tariffs, or do they write a sweeping opinion about presidential emergency powers that will govern cases for the next 50 years? Fourth, What does the Chief Justice do? John Roberts cares deeply about the court's institutional reputation. If he's in the majority, his opinion will likely try to find middle ground. If he's in dissent, that tells you the conservative coalition fractured. And fifth, what's the vote count? 6-3 along ideological lines? 7-2 with Kagan or Kavanaugh switching sides? 8-1 with only Sotomayor or Thomas dissenting? The vote itself tells a story about how the justices see the balance between presidential power and congressional authority. 133 billion. 9 justices. 1 decision. February 20th. The machinery of constitutional government is about to render judgment on whether the separation of powers still means something, or whether we've entered an era where presidents can declare emergencies at will and govern without Congress. This is the case that defines the limits of executive authority for our generation. And the answer is coming next week. Stay here. Stay watching. I'll have analysis the moment that opinion drops, breaking down every paragraph, every footnote, every implication. This is history happening in real time, and you're here for it.